Basically, the Energy Charter Treaty is a massive investment agreement. It's between 50 countries and it's specifically for the energy sector. So it actually dates back to the 1990s, where think like fall of the Berlin Wall, Western investors are worrying about if they start investing in these sort of like newly privatized economies, they're worried about if the countries would then go back to becoming socialist economies and they would lose their investments. So that's the kind of context it was set up. That's obviously very much not the context now. So it's very out of date and very unfit for purpose. And one of the main reasons we campaign on it is that at its core is this very contentious investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS mechanism. At GGM, we often call this corporate courts. So I'll sort of use ISDS and corporate courts interchangeably as I talk about it. But this is this clause that's inserted into different trade and investment agreements, which allows companies based in one country that's party to the agreement to sue the government of a country that's also party to the agreement outside of any national legal system, in secretive tribunals, and in cases that run into the millions and billions of pounds or dollars or euros or whatever the relevant currency. So the main reason we campaign on the Energy Charter Treaty, or why it's such an important campaign for us, is the intersection with climate issues. Because it's a treaty relevant to specifically for the energy sector, that means that the companies we're seeing using it to sue governments are fossil fuel companies, and they're using it when governments are putting in place climate policies, which they perceive to threaten their profits. And essentially their assets becoming obsolete, are becoming stranded, and this is their way to cash in the transition and to transfer the cost of those stranded assets onto the taxpayer. So the risk of these cases has been growing and growing. The ECT used to generate, there was, in its early years, there's maybe about 10 claims a year. And now that we're getting into the hundreds, and it's made it the kind of world's most litigated ISDS agreement. The exciting thing, though, is that lots of countries are now realizing the risk of this. So last year, a whole cascade of countries, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Poland, Slovenia, and Luxembourg have all announced that they're leaving the ECT. Italy already left a few years ago. This follows attempts to address the problems of the ECT through a reform process. So we've always argued that the reform proposals are very weak and completely insufficient. They keep existing fossil fuel projects protected by ISDS for 10 more years. And what's more crucial is that the reform process has basically just collapsed. So with all of these countries saying that they're going to leave, the main pushers for the reform process are largely these European countries. And now that they're saying the reform isn't enough, we're going, the lack of support for the reform process basically means that they keep delaying and delaying a vote on it. It was delayed from November. There's a date in the diary for April. We think that probably won't go ahead because the Secretariat of the ECT knows that without the European Union and lots of these European Union countries, they don't have enough support. So even this very weak reform process has basically failed. So the most recent news in the campaign is that the European Commission has changed its position and is kind of officially recommending a coordinated withdrawal of the whole EU. So previously it was just seeing various EU member states saying that they were going to leave. Now it's recommending that the EU as a whole leaves together. This is important because the Energy Charter Treaty has this kind of sting in its tail that's called a sunset clause. This basically means that a country can decide to leave, but it's still bound by the agreement for 20 years, which is just obscene in and of itself. The way to get out of this is that the countries who are leaving, which is these European countries currently, and what the European Union is now recommending that the EU as a whole does, is to withdraw collectively in a coordinated way, and to have something called an Interstate Agreement. So that basically they all agree amongst each other that they will not enforce any judgments that are passed through investment arbitration through the ECT. So they can basically agree that they're not going to sue each other, or that if companies based in the EU sue each other, they're not going to enforce those judgments. This basically neutralizes the sunset clause. And it doesn't have to be just the European Union. It doesn't have to be like an EU thing. This can be an agreement between any members of the Energy Charter Treaty who are deciding to leave. So we're at the point in the campaign where we're really trying to urgently push the UK government, saying, if you don't leave now alongside these other exiting countries, you miss out on the opportunity to join this coordinated withdrawal, which has the opportunity to neutralize the sunset clause. So the longer they delay and delay and delay, they're missing the opportunity to kind of get on this bandwagon and to neutralize all of that risk. And the really important thing is that it will neutralize. There's research done recently that shows it's 99%, because most of the investors in fossil fuel projects in the UK, the ones that we are likely, if the government keeps, or a future government keeps to any climate commitments, if they do phase out these fossil fuel projects, the investors behind those projects are largely based in EU countries. So that's why it's really important to get a part of this coordinated withdrawal with those countries, because then the suing won't take place. There's a very tiny amount of investment from countries that are also members of the Energy Charter Treaty, like Azerbaijan and somewhere else, it escapes me, maybe Japan. But the most of the investment is coming from the European Union. So if they're taking part in this agreement not to sue each other, we really have a big interest in getting involved in that. And the UK government is really shooting itself in its foot by not doing so. So that's the main argumentation we're using with the government at the moment. And what we're seeing is that the political calculus in the UK has really changed. So it's now becoming something like truly up for debate across the political spectrum. Like even conservative voices are kind of slowly coming out a bit more publicly to call for exit. We recently helped write an op-ed with Chris Skidmore, who's a Conservative MP. He's the chair of the Net Zero Review, and we placed a sort of opinion piece in the Financial Times where he publicly calls on his government colleagues to withdraw the UK from the Energy Charter Treaty. So it's really helpful at this point in the campaign is we're trying to kind of encourage our activists and people in the Global Justice Now network to meet with their MPs. We've actually had a very high rate of getting emails to MPs through our kind of supporter emails. Lots of our supporters have been emailing their MPs. Some of you might have done it. We looked into our email data, and we've reached about 90% of the House of Commons. But what we're seeing is all these kind of stock responses rolling through. When MPs get an email, they select the response from their database and ping it back out. And the government position and the opposition position in the Labour position has basically been, we're monitoring it. We're monitoring what's happening in Europe. We're monitoring what's happening with the reform. So we think at this stage, it's really crucial to get kind of face-to-face conversations going where they can't, sidestep that conversation. So we're having numbers of our supporters across the country organising meetings with their MPs. And the hope is that at this point, what's really going to push it is these kind of called whispers in the ear around Parliament, with people saying guys, this is getting a bit embarrassing. We do need to we do need to say something amongst the opposition. And what's really, we think, going to push the Conservative government is having a few voices who are a bit more on side, who are maybe more open to talking about green issues, however that may translate into their actual actions, saying this is actually really risky, this is financially risky, and major economies that, are sort of traditionally, follow the same kind of values as us are moving in this way. So the more kind of energy we can get around those conversations, the better. I won't claim to be a Scotland expert, and Jane has helpfully worked with me to we've basically put together a set of documents to help activists go about the process of meeting their MP, and then once you're in the meeting, what to say, because we know that it's like, you know, trade can be a difficult, technical, tricky thing to talk about. People can be concerned about not knowing everything, or not having all of the facts. So we've put together a messaging guide of like how to talk about the Energy Charter Treaty, how to talk about it to more conservative voices, like the kind of arguments to employ, because there basically is a very like, it's quite easy to make a more like Tory case around the Energy Charter Treaty. It's employing rhetoric around like sovereignty and, you know, rule of law and a level playing field for all businesses, because obviously this ISDS mechanism is not something that UK companies can use vis-a-vis the UK government. It's only open to foreign investors to sue the UK government. So we can go into that a bit more, maybe if people have more questions, and I'll make sure to reshare all of these documents. But we also looked a bit at, you know, the situation in Scotland. The SNP does have a long-standing position against ISDS, although nowadays we're seeing they're kind of trying to present that as like ISDS in its current form. My colleague Jean had a good call with some Scottish government officials, and they really had been concerned about this sunset clause. So this is something that politicians often come back to us with, like, well, you know, if we leave now, it's still going to be 20 years of the potential of being sued. So the case we're really trying to make in that meeting is, this is how the Interstate Agreement works. This is how a coordinated withdrawal works. There is legal precedent for that. There are lots of lawyers who said this is work, and the fact that the European Commission is exploring it as the most viable option shows that way out is feasible and attractive. And they were sort of, we think, fairly persuaded on that, which is a good sign. And I mean, I'm not a legal expert either, but I can talk a little bit more about how the kind of legality of the Interstate Agreement, if people are really interested in that, but it's not very interesting. Show you some of these materials, just so, let me see if this works. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Great. So this is a kind of intro document to how you might, the kind of steps you may go through to meet your MP. And I just want to draw attention to some of them. So we have a template letter to do that initial reaching out, and you know, this may be very common practice for many of you, but I just, you know, wanted to flag to people that there are certain areas of these documents which we shared which require kind of personalization. So here you can search your MP's desired salutation. Some of them really like to be called Right Honourable. And then adding your name, and very important to add your address, because they need to ensure that you're a constituent usually, and to deign to reply to you. We also have this parliamentary briefing, which you can share with your MP. You can send it to them via email, or print out a copy, and if you were to meet them in person, to hand it over. That would be great. And then there's some further guidance here in it. We have a guide on like how to lobby decision makers, and kind of talks through a bit more of the details of the process about how you meet your MP, some of the just like etiquette around it, things to remember, you know, how to go about the process. And I won't spend too much time talking about that. The other, I actually do have this open already. This is the messaging guide I mentioned. So we kind of split it into the different parties to talk about to kind of highlight the different arguments that resonate with different audiences. What's quite useful at the end of this document, you'll see we have something called FAQs and rebuttals. This is quite useful for these kind of questions that often come up. So when people are saying like, oh, it's being reformed, or doesn't it support renewable energy? questions about the sunset clause. So these are my little, like, how I'd rebut those kind of arguments. We've also got a section here on the SNP and Scotland, and I'm sure this is much more your guys' area than mine, so I'm preaching to the choir. But what's really important in this is that, you know, Scotland has its own just transition and its own kind of draft energy strategy. Basically, this relies upon the UK government beginning to phase out oil and gas in the North Sea and doing so quickly. If the UK government is at risk of being sued by fossil fuel companies through the ECT, then it's more likely to like drag its heels on this. So the ECT is very relevant to Scotland's plans. And there's also the case that, you know, if Scotland were to be sued by a fossil fuel company called using ISDS, then the UK government would be called on to defend the case, but it would be the Scottish government who would have to pay the costs if the case was lost. So that's quite a key point to raise with Scottish parliamentarians. And, you know, we can discuss a bit more of that later. See if there's anything else. We also, so one of the key things I think to flag in, you know, it's all very well meeting your MP. It's very good to go with a set of asks. What we're mainly trying to get from people is, excitingly, we've actually got a Westminster Hall debate now scheduled in for next week. It would be great to get as many MPs as possible along to that. This is a, you know, it's a kind of meeting that happens in Parliament. It's outside of the legislative process, but it's a great way to raise the profile of an issue. We're trying to get MPs to write to the Secretaries of State. That's Kemi Badenoch and Grant Shapps are the current relevant ones. They can submit parliamentary questions, and, you know, the ideal, obviously, because the parties aren't coming out very publicly against this, the more MPs we can actually get to break through that and put their own statements out on social media or to speak to the press, like Chris Skidmore has done, would raise the pressure greatly. So that would be great if they were, and we can kind of guide and help with any of these processes, especially going through any parliamentary processes or writing press releases or comment pieces. So if you were to have any success in talking to your MP about any of these asks, we can, you know, guide on the next steps, and it'd be great to be kept in the loop on that. I'll stop there because, you know, all of those documents exist, and I'm always at the end of an email if anyone has questions about those.